welcome to Inside Events, a new international contemporary podcast focused on key issues in events and festivals. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Barbara Grabher, and we're going to be talking about the anthropology in the context of events. Welcome, Barbara. If you could tell us a little bit about you, the role in the organization that you work for, and why are you interested in the anthropology of events?
Hi, thank you very much for having me. Lovely to see you in this virtual format. My name is Barbara Grabher. I'm a lecturer at the University of Brighton in event studies, and I teach undergrad and postgraduate courses on international event management. I'm a trained anthropologist, specialized in the field of gender studies and working on event-based regeneration. In my research, particularly informed by a lens of critical event studies. I'm also the author of the monograph Doing Gender in Events, Feminist Perspectives on Critical Event Studies, and currently one of the editors of the forthcoming book, Event and Infrastructures, Critical Interrogations, which hopefully should be out by spring next year. My current research is addressing the question of the Anthropocene and environmental sustainability as a value within event-based regeneration. And I'm very much basing this on an anthropological take on it, which means on one side, anthropology is best known for we're working ethnographically. So we do so-called field work, we do observations, we work with people, doing interviews and so forth. But also beyond that, it's also the kind of framework that I apply to my understanding of events, what events mean to society. And this relationship between anthropology and events is for me a journey that I have embarked on in my PhD. I was working on event-based regeneration through the City Capital of Culture framework in Hull and Donosti San Sebastian. And while obviously I'm informed from my background as an anthropologist, I was really curious to understand how events work for society. And I mean, what isn't interesting about the fact that actually, why do we actually celebrate? And what do we celebrate? And how do we celebrate? And what does this celebration do to society? Are kind of key questions that I started to explore within the context of my PhD research and started to delve into this whole disciplinary discussion that comes from anthropology, but connects also to other disciplines and opens up this entire debate on why are we doing events? I think that would be kind of my main concern or my main interest in this topic.
That's great. Thanks, Barbara. And every time I mention anthropology to my students, they run for the hills because it's a concept that they would have never disciplined with a set of concepts that frighten the bejesus out of them. For your first year students or second year students or whenever you kind of bring this idea in, could you explain a little bit or kind of perhaps define what we mean by anthropology?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if we take it apart, anthropology is the science of the human. Anthropology as a discipline needs to be separated out in various different traditions. And I speak from an anthropology that is informed by social sciences and humanities. So it has very strong links to other disciplines like sociology. It has very strong links as well to disciplines of philosophy and mixes all of them up together. So even in my undergrad and my different programs that I did throughout my career, anthropology was this really nice combination of like really heavy conceptual ideas mixed with really real life applications. So where does this actually take place, like events? And I think this is the interesting side of the anthropological discipline. That actually it has a very strong human focus. There is obviously also the biological anthropology, but I'm going to keep that out of the picture right now. So when you speak about the discipline itself, the discipline is a very wide one. It has a long, strong tradition and history. Has been going on for centuries, but specifically nowadays we see a revival of the ethnographic methods that we're using, and anthropology in itself kind of revitalizing itself as well, asking new questions, asking new concerns, and events is part of that kind of contemporary re-understanding of what anthropology is all about. When I would break it down in terms of what the discipline does for event studies, it is mainly the contribution of certain perspectives onto events. So what events can be in terms of what I asked beforehand, why do we celebrate or why do we hold events? But also there's certain concepts that we see coming through quite a lot. And I'm quite sure that actually students that might even be scared of anthropology to some extent will know those concepts, because they're being used not just in the anthropological discipline, but beyond that, especially in like wider understanding of the events. So we have, if we go back into the history and the traditions of anthropology, we have names like Victor Turner's liminality, or his partner's further development then of the word, or the notion of communitas, Edith Turner's take on that. We have Bacton's carnivalesque that is borrowing from cultural studies into anthropological takes on event studies. We have questions of Bourdieu's social capitals that are very strong anthropological concepts that are being used in the study of events, but also more contemporary aspects such as Anderson's imagined communities or Butler's performativity is being quite frequently used now in order to take an anthropological lens onto events. Generally speaking, I think I would summarize the anthropological perspective onto events through the why question. So why do we as a society celebrate? But then at the same time, I think it's really interesting to understand how the anthropological take is opening doors that have already been opened before, because anthropology is one of the pioneering disciplines within event studies in the widest term possible. So anthropology in its original times, so let's go back 100 years, they would have not called it the event, but there's a lot of research going on about this idea of the event. We call it the festive, the celebration, the ritual, maybe even the tradition. But a lot of anthropological texts actually picked up on that idea of the event already from the 1940s, 50s, 60s onwards. And I think that makes it really interesting as well to see that kind of rich history and how it is applied to contemporary times, contemporary concepts and notions of events, and gives as well this kind of developmental stage of where a discipline can contribute certain questions over others. Does that answer your question, Morris?
It certainly does. That's really, really, really comprehensive, and it begs the question. And I think that it's in there. It was in your answer, really, that you've just given. But if students should care about applying these ideas and concepts, they seem quite ethereal in lots of different ways. They're, events management degrees and sport management degrees are way too functional, way too focused on the economic, way too focused. How you do this, how, instead of the why, as you mentioned, which is what anthropology can help with much better. Why should students draw on these concepts to explain or understand events, and why should they care?
You implied it already in the question, like why shouldn't they care about how we celebrate, why we celebrate? But obviously, I think it's really important as well, because it will improve the how question. It will improve to understand and really have the full picture of a thing. If we're not just focused on how to operationalize something, but actually also understand, why is this happening? Why are we doing this? And seeing those nuances behind it. I see it a lot happening in my current editing of the book. We look at this idea of the event infrastructure, so something like fences, something like toilet facilities, something like financial sponsorships. And we're not asking how do you do fences? We're asking, why are you doing those fences? And what is the meaning behind those fences? What is going to happen if you have that fence in front of your house? What is going to happen if you experience that fence? And I think this is kind of the kind of care that I want to provoke in students, is the idea that actually every act that you do in an event setting, if you're an event manager, will have social implications, will have cultural repercussions, will have political influences. And I think you need to be really well aware of that. On the one side, in order not to make mistakes, but also because you can influence so much on a level of event management, you can do so much. And we've seen how political events are, in recent times even more so, how much politics are taking place in events. And I think this is something that the event manager needs to be very aware of how much potential they actually hold in those events. And I think this is coming back to the idea as well of how anthropology is taking on events as a concept or as a notion, because it's understanding events not just as a thing. It's not just an organizational format of saying like, oh, let's sit all together in a circle. It's actually being in an event or doing in an event is actually a form of representing and presenting how society works. So I often call it as like if you look at simplifying it, if you look at soup, that's all of society mixed in together, blended down. You can't really differentiate anything about it anymore. It's just a massive soup. But actually, if you have a spoon and you start to kind of like take it apart, you see, for example, in the minestrone, you see that there is like elements in it of like different vegetables and so forth. For me, the spoon is the event. The event allows me to actually start steering, because the event has that potential of actually creating social cultural significance and showing that as well. And I would actually even go so far as to call that spoon, that event, a tool that makes meaning in that soup, that allows me to see different aspects, different sides of it. But it also tells me what kind of different meanings are being created in society. And this is where I find it really exciting and interesting to start digging and eating that soup.
I love it. I love the soup analogy. And we were chatting with Brianna Wyatt just around the events as storytelling, forms of storytelling, and how every single just little bit of detail about the event, whether it's the pre-event communications right through to the kind of the animation of the event, right through to the kind of the choice of doorknobs, a little bit like your fence analogy, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just so interesting to say that if you think about an event as a story, whether that's a story stitched into a community or the story of the event itself, you have to think about every single component, every single element that brings all that together, and get people to think beyond, well, that it's a fence that shuttles people between the train station and the venue, dummy. No, that fence is rooted in its place, its context. That fence is the difference between these people winning or these people losing. That fence represents, and where that fence is positioned represents everything. It represents everything, and I love what you say about the idea that kind of events are this sort of kind of microcosm of society. They reflect and then reproduce society in loads of different ways. So, like, if you really care about local people and their interests, don't put a fence that shuns them out. And so therefore you can see through the physicality and the material aspects of these events who they prioritize. And it's really interesting, isn't it?
Can I just add on to that? Because I think, that was my experience in my PhD research, and something that continues to motivate or fascinate me is a quote from Benedict Burton, who did an anthropological take on the 19th century world fairs, specifically San Francisco. And in one of the kind of openings of his book, he's saying that those world fairs, so events in general, are not just selling goods. They're not just selling, I don't know, a drink here, a drink there. They're actually selling ideas. And it's those kind of ideas that I want to unpack. And for those kind of ideas, I need to have the anthropological lens in order to understand those ideas. And I think this is exactly when we say, like, events are not like a microcosm. They're like a representation of what's happening in society. And they're not happening in a vacuum. There's so much influence by so many sides and so many things that actually these ideas come to the surface. They become so crystal clear in the setting of an event. And I think Benedict Burton, even though it's just such a small quote, but it really makes it clear to me that actually this anthropological lens comes through when we see those ideas and understand that the events are connected to those ideas.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And going from kind of the why and the big kind of, fuzzy idea things to the more on the ground operational things as to why people in industry or why students should care about how this affects their jobs. It's fundamental. The ideas that are generated and represented in an event or festival, it is through strong stakeholder relationships, stakeholder communications, bringing the right people around the table to produce the event, whether it's where the fences go or what the theme of the entire thing is about. It's crazy. There is a really great model, the best anthropological model that I've seen in events. It was done in Annals of Tourism Research by Wu et al. 2022. And essentially it goes through the very beginning and the very end as a rite of passage. And it talks about, the importance of pre-event communications, the anticipation stage, the animation phase, the live staging phase, and the different sorts of communitas that kind of come out of it, the ideological communitas. People come together to share ideas of a kind of society that they want to live in outside of the walls of the festival. And then it goes right through to kind of reconciling people's identity and what that means for people then just kind of go back into their daily lives. And I always thought it would be so fun. I was going to pitch this, idealistically to the BBC or something, following people going to Burning Man from their dull, monochromatic lives at home. They're just stirring the coffee, really tired in the mornings, to then their preparation stage to going to Burning Man, follow them on the flight, seeing them there going crazy, doing kind of mischievous stuff, and then making friends, talking about the world, and then going back and to see what kind of actual impacts it might make on people's lives. I've always thought that doing something like that would really illustrate for me the human transformation that would come from.
I think that's perfectly picking up Victor Turner's idea of liminality that he applies to the idea of ritual, and this kind of pre, during, and after effect. I was really taken by the idea of actually that there's this kind of transformation happening, and that we are coming out of events on the other side in a different kind of way. And I think this is a really crucial and potential thing to work with. It's a really important concept, and we see that being repeated a lot. We see it also not just in terms of ritual and event studies, but we see it also in other fields happening quite a lot. Anthropology loved their liminality. At the same time, and I think this is something that we need to understand as well, anthropology is not a discipline that is studied. It's not a discipline. As society evolves, the discipline of anthropology has to evolve. And also as society evolve and develop themselves and continue and grow, events are changing and events are becoming different. So I'm actually quite interested to see how that really strong concept of liminality is being currently starting to be criticized and started to be transformed, to actually understand that what we consider this transgression element that is happening in the middle, as like the ritual continues, is not something that is available for everybody. I have spent a lot of time on this question of the privilege that comes as well with the experience of liminality, particularly when looking at something like LGBT pride parades, which is one of the kind of events that I like to look into due to the gender aspects. To be able to celebrate your identity in the context of a pride, it is connected to massive amounts of privileges. It's connected not just to this liberation and this freedom of norms and this kind of norm out of the norm idea that Victor Turner is promoting within liminality. It is also connected to a lot of restraints. It's connected to a lot of situations where you will not be able to handle in those kind of way the same kind of transgression that you might experience. It comes out of personal experiences as well, of having participated in pride events in countries where it was not safe to participate in those kind of parades that were not parades but actually demonstrations or protests. So this kind of element of liminality, I think, which in contemporary times we need to understand as well, that this is transforming, and this is in contemporary times not just the liberated freedom of norm out of the norm and everything is crazy. It's also liminality means other things as well. It means also the privilege that comes with it. It means also the hegemony that comes with it. It means also the power dynamics that are established in it. And all of these questions can be played out or can be seen in an event setting when we apply that kind of concept. So I find it really interesting to think about, yes, that transition that people undergo, but also understand like all of the kind of surrounding elements that will actually affect the fact that you can go to Burning Man and have that transformative experience, or that you can go to an LGBT pride parade and have that transformative experience. I'm not undermining the fact that people have that, but at the same time, I need to understand that not everybody experiences that in the same kind of way, and liminality is not something that is kind of like butter spread on bread that is just covering all of it. Liminality is something that very particularly happens to individuals in those kind of communities that are celebrating together.
That's really well explained, and from a similar critical event studies perspective, I would apply the exact same thing on other sort of social economic issues when it comes to kind of planning these things and delivering these things. They should always be looked at a critical edge, and often where we don't really want to critique these types of kind of third spaces, these spaces of fun and frivolity, because it's like, well, home and work, the other spaces that we have to do, they're the kind of serious stuff, they're the boring. So therefore, in some sense, events and festivals do get away with kind of having less critique on them, and that is illustrated by the overtly positive slant that people have always used liminality for. So I love the fact that you just balance that, because it's so important for the critical debate. But it comes down to, how can that inform the how? How can we therefore create experiences that optimize the net benefit? If I can be so blasé with the way that I frame that, the net benefit of hosting these things. Great. We'll finish with the final question, Barbara, which is, and again, I guess it kind of segues quite neatly from the last one, which is, to what extent, where are we going with this kind of idea, these ideas of anthropology and the ideas that we've mentioned so far? What's the kind of future trends that you might kind of suggest that we keep on our radar?
So as I said beforehand, I think societies are constantly changing. Events with societies are constantly changing, and the discipline of anthropology has to keep up with that. I definitely wouldn't want to use the same old concepts that we used 100 years in contemporary times. I think they need to have a adjustment. They need to have a reinterpretation of them, and I think that is happening right now. We've seen amazing edited volumes coming out in that respect, with Le Monde and Moss engaging with that question of liminality in critical event studies. I find it really interesting as well to think about questions of gender-based violence that Louise Platt and Rebecca Finkel were doing in their edited volume, and think about those critical questions of liminality through that. I think also other concepts are having that kind of transformation moment at the moment. So carnivalesque is something that is being picked up again. Obviously, Bourdieu's capital forms are being picked up again. But then, and this is something that I find very important, is to not stick to those, let's say, comfortable routes of the ones that we've already kind of covered and known for a long time. And in my current research, this is actually something that I am bringing in, because I reintroduce a notion that has not been discussed much in critical event studies, or in event studies in general, but is a huge deal right now in other subjects, and this is the notion of the Anthropocene. So we all know we're in a multiplicity of crises, but one of the main dominating one is climate crisis right now. And the notion of the Anthropocene is a declaration from a geology point of view that we're no longer situated in a time where the human imprint on the environment can no longer be reversed. This is obviously on a level of geology quite interesting, but it talks a lot about the human-environment relationship. And we have a long-standing debate about environmental sustainability in questions of greening events and so forth, and this is very practical. How do we green an event? But what I am interested in is actually to see what is the conceptual and empirical potential of the Anthropocene when we look into events and event studies. Where do we take all of this? There's a lot of notions of time and space in events that are actually very relatable to the Anthropocene. There's a lot of notion of global and local that are related to questions of the Anthropocene. A lot of questions of relationships between human and environment that have actually been seen in both of those concepts. And I think this is the potential, or the key trend for the future, is to see events in a spectrum of all different kinds of influences. Let's say the Anthropocene as a concept is one of them. There's other concepts that we need to pick up and bring into the notion of, or into the debate of events, because events are not by themselves something. Events are what we make them speak to. And I think this is, for the key trend for the future, something really interesting, to actually let events speak, and speak with events about those kind of grand notions like the Anthropocene, like beforehand mentioned performativity, all of these kind of debates that are going on in the social sciences and the humanities, and actually bring them to event studies as well. I'm a big defender of not thinking in disciplinary terms. I hope I made that clear as well in the conversation. I think anthropology is one perspective that is borrowing from a lot of other perspectives as well. And I think this is the grand possibilities with event studies, that we're actually not bound to discipline, but we can speak beyond it. The anthropological lens is one lens that allows it, but the anthropological lens and events allow it a lot to have conversations that go beyond the kind of bucket of all different kinds of questions. And spilling over that bucket is going to be a massive key future trend in order to keep on informing how we think about events And this is what excites me actually to keep on working in this field.
I'm with you. Thank you so much, Barbara. It really excites me too. I think we've got a long way to go to really understand the power and potential of events for social good and for bad. And we just need to keep doing better. There's a lot more academics writing in the space. There's a lot, the contribution of events to global GDP is growing and growing and growing. The ways in which events are spilling out and permeating into public spaces and society and communities and all that sort of all these kind of more open local spaces is becoming increasingly de rigueur. So these questions are not going away at all. They're just intensifying. So hopefully everyone will find that super interesting. I did. And any resources, we'll have a chat afterwards, but any resources that could support this podcast will pop underneath the podcast so people can have a further reading on that alongside this podcast. But thank you so much for joining us on Inside Events. And hopefully in the future, we'll have another conversation as well, maybe something to do with some of the concepts specifically that you mentioned, Barbara.
Thank you.